"She is nothing to you now," said Lord Ashworth, setting his glass on the mantelpiece with the precise finality of a man who believed that the matter had already been decided. "Whatever she was, she is nothing now." William Ashford, the Duke of Harwick, did not respond. He stood at the window of his father's study and watched the rain move in sheets across the London courtyard below, and he said nothing at all, which was the only answer Lord Ashworth had ever been unable to argue with. That had been 6 years ago. The ballroom at Devereux House was exactly the kind of room that existed to remind everyone present of their position within it. 300 candles burned in the chandeliers overhead. The women moved in silk and pearl and careful arrangement, and the men stood in tailored black coats that announced, without a word spoken, the particular gradations of English title and English money that separated one cluster of guests from the next. The orchestra played Handel in the gallery above, and the sound fell over the assembled company like something designed, like weather engineered specifically for an occasion, which in a sense it was. Lady Devereux had planned this evening for 7 months, and it showed in every considered detail. The orchids flown from the south of France, the champagne from a specific Reims vineyard whose name she had mentioned to 4 separate people already this week, the seating arrangement that had taken 3 different revisions and a consultation with her social secretary to achieve. William stood at the edge of all of it, in the particular way he stood at every social occasion now, as a man completing an obligation rather than attending an event. He held his champagne without drinking it. He had spoken to 6 people and remembered none of what they had said. Lord Pemberton had made a point about the new railway legislation, and William had responded in some appropriate register, and Pemberton had looked satisfied, and then William had moved on, and the whole exchange had left him with the faint sense of having walked through a room that was already behind him before he had properly entered it. He was 34 years old. He had been a duke for 3 years, since his father's death in the winter of 1847. He had the estate, the title, the London house in Mayfair, the tenanted farms in Derbyshire, the seat in the Lords, and the particular kind of authority that requires nothing to announce itself. He also had, in the opinion of his social circle, a moral obligation to marry before the next season was out. Lady Constance Everleigh had been mentioned by 4 separate parties, including his aunt, including Lady Devereux herself, and including, once, Lord Pemberton, in what he clearly believed was a casual register. Lady Constance was standing near the French doors in a gown the colour of pale roses, her dark hair arranged with small diamonds at the temple, and she was both beautiful and entirely correct in every particular. She had breeding, connections, an excellent education, and the kind of poise that had been trained into her since infancy. She looked, William thought, like a woman who had been constructed specifically to be a duchess, which was both accurate and the exact reason he found it impossible to cross the room toward her. Then he heard the laugh. It came from somewhere to his left, past the 3rd pillar, where the orchestra's sound thinned slightly, and it was not the kind of laugh that belonged in this room. It was not the careful, modulated social laugh that he had been hearing all evening, the sound that said, "I am enjoying myself," without too much evidence of it. It was a real laugh, sudden and genuine, the kind that cannot be managed after the fact. And it stopped him the way a note played in the wrong key stops a listener, even when they cannot immediately name why. He turned. And at the edge of all that arranged magnificence, standing beside a woman he did not recognize, with a glass of champagne she appeared to have forgotten she was holding, and a laugh still fading from her expression, was Millicent Carr. He had not seen her in 6 years. She wore a gown of deep green that was clearly not this season's fashion, and her hair was arranged more simply than every other woman in the room, and she was not looking at him. She was looking at her companion, saying something he could not hear, her face carrying an expression he recognized instantly, even across 30 feet of candle-lit ballroom. The particular look of someone who has just said exactly what they meant and found it land correctly. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She had learned that a long time ago. He had thrown her away. That was the accurate word for it. And William Ashford, who prided himself on precise thinking in most matters, had spent 6 years failing to use it. Millicent Carr had come to Harwick Estate in the spring of 1844, not as a guest and not as a servant, but in the particular position that English households occasionally produced for women of good family and reduced circumstance. She had arrived as a companion to his mother, the late Duchess of Harwick, who had been ill with a progressive weakness of the lungs and had required, in her own words, someone with enough sense to read to me without performing it. She had been 22. She had arrived from Leicestershire with one trunk and a portfolio of her own accounts, not her family's, her own, the detailed financial management of what remained of her father's estate after his death, left her mother and younger brother in the care of their creditor-pressed property and a solicitor who had made clear that the existing management was inadequate. She had taken that management in hand herself at the age of 19, in the 3 years before she came to Harwick. She had renegotiated 2 creditor agreements, identified a discrepancy in the wool merchant accounts that recovered £40 per annum, and arranged a long-term tenancy on the eastern pasture land that stabilised the property's annual income sufficiently to keep the family in the house another decade. She had done all of this while her mother believed she was attending to domestic correspondence, because it was 1841 and the solicitor would only speak with her if she presented herself as acting on her brother Edward's authority, which she had done without compunction and without apology. She had arrived at Harwick with all of that knowledge and none of the credit for it, which was a pattern she had already decided she was not going to spend her life mourning. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. At Harwick, in that first year, this was Millicent Carr, and almost no one knew it. The Duchess had liked her immediately, which was not what anyone had expected. Lady Ashford had interviewed 4 companions in as many months and dismissed each of them for reasons she declined to specify in detail. Millicent had arrived, sat down without fidgeting, and answered the Duchess's questions in a measured, direct manner that did not attempt to please and did not apologise for not attempting to please. The Duchess had watched her for a long moment and then said, "You will read to me in the mornings. You will not read to me in the afternoons, because I want those for sleeping. If you notice something wrong in this house, you will tell me." "I notice several things already," Millicent had said. The Duchess had smiled at that, and the arrangement had been made. What Millicent noticed, in the 3 years she spent at Harwick, was significant. The estate had been managed by a succession of stewards of varying competence, the most recent of whom was a man named Schofield, who carried the correct appearance of thorough administration, while producing results that did not bear careful examination. The household accounts showed a quarterly expenditure on firewood that Millicent calculated as 20% above what the equivalent winter months required, given the number of occupied rooms. The kitchen supplier agreements had not been renegotiated in 9 years, which meant the estate was paying 1835 rates for provisions in the inflationary market of 1844. The tenancy records for the South Farms showed 3 vacancies that had been carried on the books as occupied for 11 months, meaning the rental income had been reported at levels that did not reflect actual receipts. She brought none of this to Schofield. She brought it, instead, quietly and incrementally, to the Duchess. Lady Ashford had listened to Millicent's first such report, with the expression of a woman who had suspected something in the general vicinity of what she was now hearing, and had been waiting for someone to bring her the specific terms. "Write it down," she had said. "All of it, with the numbers." Millicent had written it down. She had made a second copy. She had given one to the Duchess and kept one in her own portfolio. It was the summer of 1845, and she was 23, and she had managed this quietly for 14 months before anyone in the household of standing had noticed that she was doing it. The exception was a man named Mr. Clement Davies, the family's senior solicitor, who had visited Harwick on estate business in August of that year and had found Millicent in the morning room reviewing a tenancy agreement with a detail that stopped him in the doorway. He had watched her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You've found the Southern Farm discrepancy." 3 weeks ago, she said. "It is in the report for the Duchess." He had looked at her then, with the particular expression of a man who has just found something he did not expect to find, and is reassessing the whole room accordingly. "I have been the family's solicitor for 19 years, he said, "and I have reviewed that tenancy record 6 times. "You were looking at it as a legal document," Millicent said. "I looked at it as an accounting one." Mr. Davies had said nothing further, but he had begun, after that, to make a point of speaking with her whenever he came to Harwick, which over the following year was 4 times. He brought estate questions to her that he framed as administrative clarifications, and she answered them with the same quiet specificity she brought to everything, and neither of them mentioned to the Duchess that this was happening, and both of them understood that it was necessary. It was in this same period that William Ashford first came to understand that Millicent Carr existed. He had known she was there, in the vague way that a man in his late 20s knows the names of the people in his mother's household without having thought carefully about any of them. He had seen her at meals. He had observed her efficiency. He had noticed, without articulating it, that the household had been running better for some time, and that he could not trace the improvement to anything Schofield had done. Then he had come home to Harwick in October of 1845 for a fortnight, and he had walked into the library at 10:30 in the evening, and she had been there. She had not heard him enter. She was seated at the writing table near the window, with 3 account books open in front of her, and a candle positioned to her left, and she was making annotations in the margin of the middle volume, in a hand so small and precise that he had to step closer before he could read it. She was comparing the Schofield expense reports against the supplier invoices, line by line, and the margin notes were corrections. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he should have. She looked up. She did not startle. She said, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I was not aware you required the library this evening." "I did not require it," he said. "What are you doing?" "The quarterly accounts," she said. "The morning hours are occupied with your mother." "That is Schofield's work." She considered him for a moment with an expression that was precise and entirely without apology. "Yes," she said, "it is." He had come to stand beside the table. He had looked at the accounts. He had seen the margin annotations, and he had understood, in the way he understood most things, quickly and then thoroughly, exactly what she was doing and exactly how long she had probably been doing it. He did not say anything. He simply pulled a chair from the wall and sat down across from her and said, "Show me." That was the beginning. They had worked in the library for 2 hours that first night, and she had shown him 3 months of account discrepancies and 4 annotated supplier agreements and the tenancy irregularity that had been costing the estate in reported income for nearly a year. She had explained it the way she explained everything, precisely and without drama, with the specific numbers in front of her and the supporting documents arranged in order, and when she said something he did not follow, she waited, and when he asked a question, she answered it directly. He had not met many people who spoke to him the way she did, as though he were capable of understanding the thing she was explaining, which was simultaneously a courtesy and a kind of demand. He came to the library 3 nights later. She was there. He came again, 4 days after that. She was there. He had not been in love with her yet, or he had been, which was the same thing from the outside. He had needed her company in the specific way that a man who has been cold for a long time needs a room that is not cold, and he had not recognized the need for what it was because it was so far from what he had been told to want. She had been 24 when she told him about her mother's estate in Leicestershire, not as a confidence, not as an appeal. She had mentioned it in the context of the tenancy renegotiation, because her own experience with a similar document gave her a point of comparison. He had listened, and then asked a question he had not intended to ask. "How old were you when your father died?" 19, she said. Edward was 16. There was no one else. "And the solicitor was helpful," she said, in a tone that closed the subject with the precise weight of someone who has decided that a door does not need to be opened further. He had understood then, not entirely, not yet, but in the way that something becomes load-bearing before you have named it as such, that she had managed a full household's financial crisis at an age when most women of her position were learning watercolours, and that she had done it quietly, and that she had come to Harwick and done it again, and that no one had credited her for any of it. He had wanted to say something about that. He had not, because he did not have the right language yet, and he was not a man who spoke before he had the language. He had been wrong to wait. By the autumn of 1846, they had spent many evenings in the library, and the accounting irregularities had been documented thoroughly enough that Schofield had been discharged without needing to be confronted directly. Mr. Davies had arranged it with the kind of quiet efficiency that spoke to long practice. The estate had improved. His mother, who had known about Millicent's work from the beginning, and had kept her own counsel about it, with the patience of a woman who understood that the right moment for certain information is not always the first available one, had said to William in September of that year, "That young woman has been keeping this house solvent for 2 years. I thought you ought to know." He had said, "I know." "Do you?" his mother said. It was in that autumn, in the privacy of their evenings in the library, and the rare afternoon she was free, when they had walked in the kitchen garden, because she had a tendency to learn the names of plants in the same systematic way she learned everything else, that William Ashford had understood that he was in love with Millicent Carr. He had not told her. He had, instead, stood in the corridor outside the morning room one Wednesday evening and listened to her read to his mother, and then done this again on Thursday, and then done it again on Friday, and been aware each time that what he was doing was both specific and irrevocable. He told his father. Lord Ashworth, William's father, who held a secondary title and a considerable opinion, had listened to his son with the stillness of a man who was not surprised but was resolute. He had said what he said about Millicent Carr. "She is nothing to you now." He had then presented, with the methodical precision of a man who understood systems better than people, the full architecture of why a Duke of Harwick could not choose a woman of no title, no family connections of usefulness, no fortune, and no social standing beyond the position of paid companion. He had not been cruel. He had been worse than cruel. He had been correct by every rule of the world they occupied. William had stood at that window and watched the rain and said nothing, which his father had taken as agreement. It was not agreement. It was the paralysis of a man who knew what he wanted and could not find the argument that would make wanting it structurally defensible in the language his father spoke. He had been wrong to wait for that language. 3 months later, in January of 1847, his mother died. It was faster than anyone had expected. It was very cold. Millicent had been with her, and had been the one to send the message to William in London, and had managed the immediate household arrangements with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and had made sure the Duchess was comfortable in her last 2 days, with a care that William had only learned the full extent of from Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, who had told him afterward in the blunt, direct manner of a woman who felt it was information he needed. Miss Carr did not sleep for 2 nights. She did not leave that room. He had arrived at Harwick a day after his mother's death. He had spoken to Millicent for the first time in 3 months. He had intended, he had meant, and then his father had arrived, and Lord Ashworth's presence had pressed on the household like weather coming in, and William had found himself, in the days of the funeral and the estate arrangements and the formal condolences, unable to make the sentence that he needed to make. Millicent had departed Harwick 2 weeks after the funeral. Her position had been with the Duchess. There was no longer a Duchess. She had left him a note that said, simply, "The accounts are in order. The Davies file is in the morning room cabinet. I hope you will look at it properly. He had not gone after her. It was the greatest failure of his life, and he had spent 6 years arranging it into something he could carry, which was not the same thing as resolving it, and he had nearly convinced himself that it was, and then he had heard her laugh in a crowded room, and the arrangement had come apart in a single moment, like a badly built wall meeting its first real pressure. He crossed the room. She saw him when he was 8 feet away, and the expression that moved across her face was not what he expected. Not softness, not anger, but a controlled, considered stillness, the look of a woman who has assessed a situation fully before responding to it. She had always been better at that than he was. "Your Grace," she said. The woman beside her, dark-haired, direct-eyed, with the air of someone who had already formed an opinion and was reviewing it, looked from Millicent to William with the attentiveness of a person who understands exactly what she is observing and has decided to stay precisely where she is to observe it fully. "Miss Carr," he said. There was a moment in which neither of them spoke, and the orchestra continued overhead, and the room went on being the room, and Millicent met his eyes without looking away, and he understood that she was not going to make this easier for him. She was not going to make it difficult either. She was simply going to wait, the way she waited for everything, with the patience of a person who has already decided what they will do when the information is complete. "I did not know you would be in London," he said, which was inadequate, and he knew it was inadequate as he said it. "I have been in London for 4 months, she said. "I am employed by Lord and Lady Fenwick, estate management consultation." He blinked. He could not entirely help it. Lady Fenwick asked for someone who understood the operational side, Millicent continued, with the faint, precise specificity of someone who knows they are saying something the other party will need a moment to absorb. "She was referred to Mr. Davies, who referred to me. I have been working with their Lincolnshire property accounts since March." "You are working for Fenwick," William said. "Estate management," she repeated. "Not as a companion, as a consultant." The dark-haired woman beside her said, "Charlotte Pearson," by way of introduction, looking at William with the directness of someone who has decided she likes him in principle, but has not committed to it in practice. "I work alongside Miss Carr with the Fenwick household. She is, if you are wondering, considerably better at what she does than anyone Lord Fenwick has employed in the last decade." She paused. "He has said so himself, which is to his credit." William looked at Millicent. Millicent looked back with the particular expression of a woman who is not going to prevent her colleague from speaking accurately. "Miss Carr," he said, carefully, "would you grant me a few minutes?" It was not precisely a question. She recognized that. He saw her recognize it, and he saw the small adjustment she made, not a step back, not a refusal, but a slight steadying, like a woman taking on additional weight and finding it within her capacity. "For a few minutes," she said. They walked to the far end of the gallery, away from the orchestra's direct sound, and stood near a window that looked out onto the square below where the carriages waited. William had rehearsed nothing. He had not, until 20 minutes ago, believed this conversation was one he would ever have the occasion to have. "I owed you an action," he said. "Not an apology, an action. I never took it." Millicent looked at him steadily. "That is accurate," she said. "My father—" "I know what your father said," she said. "You told me, in your letter. The one you sent in March of 1847. She held his gaze without expression. "The one that said the circumstances of the estate required a period of consolidation, and that you hoped I was settled in my new situation. Those were your words." He held them, the way you hold a document that proves something against you. "Yes. I have managed the Fenwick estate accounts for 8 months, she said. I recovered £420 annually in renegotiated supplier agreements and identified a stewardship irregularity in the East Farm tenancies that had been costing the property for 3 years. Lord Fenwick intends to have me formalise the arrangement as a standing contract. I have a draft of the terms with me. She paused. I am not telling you this to impress you. I am telling you so that you understand my circumstances, since you appear not to have known them. He had not known them. He had spent 6 years not finding out, which was its own kind of information. I know, he said. William, it was the first time she had used his name. He felt it like a stone dropped into still water. What is it that you want to say to me? He looked at her for a moment, at the green dress that was 2 seasons out of fashion, and the simple arrangement of her hair, and the expression that had not changed in 6 years. Precise, warm, entirely unperformed. He thought about the library at Harwick. He thought about the corridor where he had stood for 3 consecutive evenings and listened to her read to his mother, and how he had known even then what it was, and how he had not moved. I want to ask permission, he said, to call on you. Formally. I want to begin again, if you will allow it. She was quiet for a moment. That was real and considered, not performed. I have learned, she said, not to count on things that merely look like certainty. You will understand why I require more than a request before I give you an answer. I know, he said. I am not asking for an answer tonight. I am asking for the permission to make a case. She studied him, with the look she brought to account books and tenancy agreements, thorough, specific, without sentiment. You may call, she said. On a Wednesday. Lord Fenwick's house in Cavendish Square. Mr. Davies has the address. It was not warm, and it was not cold. It was the most she could honestly offer him, and she knew it, and he understood that she knew it, which was the first honest exchange they had had in 6 years. He inclined his head. He let her go. He stood at the window for a long time after, watching the carriages below, and understood that he had a great deal of work to do. He called on Wednesday. Mr. Davies, who had given him the address with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask for it for quite some time, had also told him, in the oblique manner of a solicitor who understands the difference between volunteering information and placing it where it can be found, that Miss Carr's contract with the Fenwicks was excellent, but informal, that Lord Fenwick had been somewhat slow in formalising the terms, and that the draft she had mentioned was, in Davies's view, correctly structured and ought to have been signed before now. William filed this information alongside the other things he was in the process of understanding. Lady Fenwick received him in the drawing-room. She was a small, bright-eyed woman in her 50s, with the air of someone who had organised considerable portions of the world around her to her satisfaction, and saw no reason this visit should be an exception. She offered him tea, and looked at him with the benign assessment of a woman who knows something she is choosing not to say yet. Millicent came in 4 minutes later. She was wearing grey, simply cut, and she had clearly come from work, because there was a slight ink mark at the side of her right forefinger that she had not entirely removed. She sat down across from him, with a small stack of papers on her knee, and looked at him with an expression that said, clearly, you may begin. He had not come to declare himself. He had come to be useful, which was the only language he knew how to speak, when the declaration itself had not yet been earned. I have spoken with Mr. Davies, he said, about the terms of your consultancy arrangement. Millicent was very still. He showed me the draft contract, William said. With your permission, I would like to review the compensation clause. The monthly figure in the draft is lower than the market rate for equivalent stewardship consultation work. I have a comparable figure from the Derbyshire Estate Agent Network, if that is useful. Charlotte Pearson, who was sitting in a chair near the window doing something with a ledger and affecting not to listen, with the transparency of someone who has entirely given up on the pretense, said, without looking up, it is £60 lower annually. William said, 62. I checked. Millicent looked at him. He looked back. You reviewed my contract draft, she said, not as an accusation, as a verification. I asked Davies to show it to me, he said. I asked your permission first, in the same sentence. I believe you heard it. She was quiet for a moment, that he had learned, over the years of knowing her, to let be quiet. I heard it, she said. Why? He could have said several things. He said the true one, because you have never charged correctly for your work. You charged the Harwick estate nothing, for 3 years, and it was worth considerably more than nothing. I cannot go back and correct that. I can make certain someone corrects this one. There was a long pause. Lady Fenwick found something to examine in her teacup. Charlotte Pearson turned a page she had clearly already read. Millicent said, "You are here to negotiate my contract." "I am here because you asked me to make a case," he said. "This is the beginning of it." He saw something move across her face. Not softness, not exactly, but the first slight adjustment of that careful composure, like a door that has not been opened for a long time and has just been tried by a hand that knows where the latch is. He came the following Wednesday as well, and the one after that, and each time he came to Cavendish Square he brought something useful. A corrected comparison figure for the supplier agreements she was renegotiating for Fenwick's Lincolnshire property, a reference from an estate agent he knew in Nottingham who had worked with a similar consultancy arrangement, a copy of a tenancy law clarification from the Inner Temple that addressed an ambiguity in the East Farm document she had mentioned. He was not doing this to impress her. She knew he was not doing it to impress her. That was the difference. The third Wednesday it rained, and Lady Fenwick offered the morning room for their meeting, rather than the drawing room, which had a window problem in the damp, and the morning room was smaller, and had a fire and books on the shelves, and was, in all material particulars, like the library at Harwick. Neither of them remarked on this. Millicent had the Fenwick account books open on the table, and she was showing him the tenancy discrepancy she had found, not because she needed him to see it, but because Davies had recommended a legal review of the mechanism, and William had the right contacts for that. She was explaining the irregularity in the quarterly receipts, when he reached across the table and turned the account book slightly toward himself to see the relevant column, and his hand was very close to hers on the table, and neither of them moved for a moment. "This figure," he said, indicating a line on the left page. "Yes," she said. "It has been carried incorrectly for 3 years. 37 months, she said. I counted. He looked up at her. She was looking at the account book with the focus of someone who is not quite looking at the account book, and the firelight was on the side of her face, and he thought, with the specific clarity of a man who has spent 6 years arriving at this moment, that she was still the most exact person he had ever known, and that the exactness was not a quality separate from the warmth, but entirely inseparable from it, and that he had known this in the library at Harwick when she was 24 years old, and he had not been enough of what was needed to act on it. He said, "Millicent." She looked up. He said, "You have ink on your forefinger." It was not what either of them expected. She looked down at her hand, and then she looked back up at him, and something shifted. Not the room, not the atmosphere, but the register between them, moving from careful and provisional to something quieter and more settled, like a conversation that has finally found the right key. "I have had it since Tuesday," she said. "The pen on the Fenwick secretary desk is defective. I will replace it. You will not. I will ask Davies to arrange it, and it will arrive on Thursday from the stationer on Fleet Street, and you will accept it, because it is a working instrument and not a declaration." She looked at him with the measuring attention of someone deciding whether this is accurate. "It had better not be a declaration," she said. "Not yet," he said. She returned to the account book, but she did not put more distance between them at the table, and he sat where he was, and they worked for another hour in the quiet that had always been between them, the specific quiet of two people who have learned each other's working silences and have stopped finding them uncomfortable. He walked home through the rain. He did not take the carriage. He had a great deal to think about, and the rain was useful. The opposition arrived, as opposition always does in its own good time, on the 4th Wednesday. He came to Cavendish Square to find a carriage outside that he recognised, the Marchmont crest on the panel. Inside the drawing room, Lord Ashworth was sitting with Lord Fenwick, in the kind of conversation that looks relaxed and is not, and Lady Constance Everleigh was seated near the window, looking composed and certain, and William's father stood up, when William entered, with an expression that said, "Clearly, I knew you would be here, and I came to make a point about it." Lord Ashworth had not been softened by 3 years of widowhood. He was 70, precise, and immovable in the particular way of men who have never had their convictions properly tested. He said, in the drawing room, in front of Lord Fenwick and Lady Fenwick, and a footman who was still in the room arranging the tea things, "I came to discuss the Harwick succession, and I find, as I expected to find, that you are here about the Carr woman." There was a silence. Lady Fenwick said something quietly to the footman, and he left the room. Lord Fenwick looked at William with the expression of a man who is caught between his instinct to help and his uncertainty about how. William said, "I believe Miss Carr is in the morning room." "I am aware of where she is," Lord Ashworth said. "I am here to speak to you, before you make a decision, that your title, your tenants, and this family's standing cannot support. Lady Constance has been patient. The arrangement that has been discussed has not been discussed with me," William said. "You have been unavailable for discussion," his father said, with the precision of a man who considers unavailability a form of argument. "You have been attending the Fenwick household every Wednesday for 5 weeks, and declining to appear at any of the social occasions where Lady Constance has been present. This is not coincidence, William. This is a choice, and I am telling you that it is a choice with consequences, for more than yourself." Lady Constance said, quietly, "I did not ask for this visit." She looked at William directly. She was honest in that moment, which he respected. "I was invited. I did not entirely refuse because I thought it would be useful for us to speak, but I did not ask Lord Ashworth to make the argument on my behalf." William looked at her. He said, "Lady Constance, I owe you a direct answer, and I have not given you one, and that is a discourtesy I regret. The answer is no, not because of your qualities, which are considerable, but because I am not able to offer you what a marriage requires, when I am committed to another direction." Lord Ashworth said, "She is a consultant. She has no name, no title, no—" "She recovered £62 annually for this household in renegotiated accounts," William said, "in her first month. She did the same for Harwick, for 3 years, at no charge, while managing my mother's household and my mother's final illness, with a care I have never adequately acknowledged." He paused. "She kept the estate solvent during a period when the steward was actively mismanaging it. She did this without anyone asking her to, and without anyone crediting her for it. If that is the measure of quality you are applying, father, then she exceeds every candidate you have presented to me." Lord Ashworth said nothing. He was not a man who was moved by emotional appeals, but he was, William had always known, a man who could not entirely dismiss an operational argument. "The succession," his father said, after a moment, "will be secured," William said. Lord Ashworth looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of a man reassessing a position he has held for a long time, and finding it, for the first time, slightly insufficient. He did not concede. He would not concede. Not here, not today. But something in the set of his face shifted, like armour adjusting under a coat, and William filed it carefully away. Millicent came in from the morning room. She had heard. She had heard enough, the walls of Cavendish Square being what they were, and Charlotte had very likely told her the rest. She stood in the doorway, with the account book under one arm and the Fenwick draft contract in her other hand, and she looked at the assembled company with the specific steadiness of a woman who has been diminished before and survived it, and is not frightened by the prospect. "Lord Ashworth," she said, "good afternoon." His father looked at her. He said nothing. "The draft contract for my consultancy arrangement with Lord Fenwick," she said, "includes a clause in Section 3 regarding the scope of work. I have added an annex that documents the specific recoveries to date and the projected annual improvement for the next 3 years, with supporting figures." She set the document on the table near Lord Fenwick's hand. "I thought it might be useful to have that on record." She did not look at William. She was doing this on her own terms, in her own manner, as she had always done everything. Lord Fenwick picked up the document. He turned to the annex. He read for a moment and said, with the satisfied expression of a man whose instinct has just been confirmed by a column of numbers, "Quite right. Quite right." Lord Ashworth said, "This is not the relevant." "It is the relevant matter," Millicent said. "Precisely and without heat. You came to discuss whether I am a suitable person. I have given you documentation of what I have done. Those are the same question, and I have answered it." The room was quiet for a moment. That had a particular quality. Not tension, but the specific stillness of a conversation that has arrived at the point where it must become a different kind of conversation or end. Lady Constance stood up. She smoothed her skirt and said, with a grace that William would always credit her for, "I believe I will have my carriage brought round." She looked at Millicent, with the direct gaze of a woman who has looked at the situation honestly, and found that the conclusion is not the one she wanted, but is the one that is there. "Miss Carr, your figures are sound. Lord Fenwick is fortunate." She inclined her head. She left. The week that followed that Wednesday was one of the 4 or 5 genuinely consequential weeks of William's adult life, though it did not look like one from the outside. He met with Lord Fenwick twice. He met with Mr. Davies 3 times. He attended a session in the Lords and had a brief, quiet conversation afterward with Lord Pembroke, who was a trustee of the Harwick estate, and whose opinion on the marriage question had been noted without being solicited. He also called on his father. Lord Ashworth received him in the study at Ashworth House. The same room, the same mantelpiece, the rain outside in a different season, but the same quality of falling, the same patience of stone. William sat down, which he had not done in any of the previous conversations he had had in this room about this subject, and said, "I am going to ask her to marry me. I wanted to tell you directly." His father said nothing for a long moment. "The succession is not in question," William said. "I intend to have a family. Her qualities as a manager of an estate are documented. Her character is beyond anything I can describe to you, in terms you will credit from me. But Davies will confirm it, and Fenwick will confirm it, and you have the document she put on that table on Wednesday." He paused. "I know you believe she is wrong for the position. I know you are not wrong by the rules you are applying. I am choosing to apply different rules." Lord Ashworth looked at him. "You will not be persuaded." "No." His father was quiet again. He looked at the mantelpiece, and at his hands, and finally back at William, with an expression that was not warm, but was, for the first time in this years-long conversation, the expression of a man who has seen something he did not expect to see, and is accommodating it. "She is not what I would have chosen," he said. "I know." "She is." He stopped. He made a small, precise movement with his hand that did not complete itself. "She is not nothing," he said, with difficulty. "It was not a blessing. It was something older and harder, the partial acknowledgement of a man whose framework has been asked to accommodate something it was not built for, and who has found, to his own surprise, that it can." William took it for what it was, which was more than he had expected. He thanked his father and left. The formal inquiry before the Harwick Estate trustees was held at Gray's Inn, in a chamber that smelled of old paper and leather, and the specific gravity of decisions made in rooms like this for 2 centuries. It had been called, at Lord Pembroke's arrangement, to address the question of the proposed consultancy expansion for the Harwick estate. William had proposed formally retaining Miss Carr as the estate's managing consultant, a proposal that required trustee approval given the existing management agreements. William had known, when he made the proposal, that it would require this. He had made it anyway. There were 7 trustees present. 4 of them were men of Lord Pemberton's general disposition, cautious, structural, attached to precedent. 2 were men William had spoken to separately in the preceding week, and who were, he believed, open to evidence. 1 was Lord Pembroke himself, who had arranged the inquiry because he considered it, as he had told William, the correct process, not because he opposed the proposal. Millicent came in after the trustees were seated, and she stood at the table at the front of the room, with a portfolio under one arm and the Fenwick Annex document in her other hand, and she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had been keeping books and managing properties for 13 years, and who knew more about the operational mechanics of an estate than every man in this room, with the possible exception of Davies, who was sitting quietly near the back. She had brought 4 documents. She placed them on the table in order: the Harwick account analysis from 1845, which she had kept in her own copy all this time, the Fenwick recovery documentation, a comparative analysis of estate management costs and returns across 3 comparable properties in the Derby and Lincoln counties over the preceding decade, and a proposed contract for her engagement with Harwick, with the compensation clause revised to the correct market rate. She said, "I understand the trustee's question is whether a woman in this position can be expected to manage the complexity of the Harwick estate accounts. I will address that question directly." She opened the first document. In 1845, the Harwick estate was carrying 3 accounts irregularities that had been present for a combined period of approximately 4 years. I identified and documented those irregularities over a period of 11 months, while employed in a capacity that had no formal connection to estate management. The documentation is in this file, including the specific line items and the correspondence with Mr. Davies. She looked up at the trustees. She did not look at William, though he was standing to the right of the room. "I did not have a title for that work. I was not paid for it. I am telling you about it now because you have asked, in effect, whether I am qualified, and the evidence is that I was performing the work before I was qualified on paper to do so." Lord Pemberton said, "Miss Carr, the question is not precisely your competence." "I know what the question is," she said, without heat. "The question is whether a woman in this role creates a structural precedent that the trustees cannot defend to the wider community of estates and investors who look to Harwick's practices as a reference. I understand that concern. I would ask you to consider that what cannot be defended is the alternative, which is that the estate continues to pay market rate for management that does not deliver what this engagement has delivered, and continues to exclude from formal credit the work that was being done informally for years." She paused. "The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. The Harwick estate has been my room, in the only sense that matters, for longer than this inquiry has been planned." The room was quiet. It was the specific quiet of a room in which a position has been stated that cannot simply be set aside, and in which several people are reassessing the weight they had assigned to their own previous convictions. Lord Pembroke said, from his place near the window, "The documents are in order." "They are," Davies said, from the back. "I have reviewed them. The figures are accurate. The methodology is sound." Lord Pembroke said, "I move that the contract be approved." 2 of the cautious trustees said nothing, which was a form of consent from men who had found that the evidence was in front of them, and declining to admit it was no longer tenable. Lord Pemberton said, quietly, to the man beside him, "The figure in Section 3 is higher than the previous management engagement." "The previous engagement was inadequately compensated," William said, from his position at the side of the room. He did not raise his voice. "The Section 3 figure is the market rate for this work. I would like the record to show that it has been agreed." Pemberton looked at him. He looked at Millicent. He looked at the document on the table, with the expression of a man who had arrived with a conclusion and found that the evidence had preceded him. "Agreed," he said. Then William crossed the chamber. He crossed it without hurry, in front of 7 trustees and Davies and the clerk who was still making notes, and he stopped in front of Millicent, and he went down on one knee, which he had not told anyone he was going to do, and he said, in the full hearing of the room, "Miss Carr, you have kept this estate better than anyone I have employed or consulted in my tenure as Duke. You have been precise and steady, and completely without vanity, about your own considerable quality. I am asking you, in front of these witnesses, to consider whether you will allow me to ask you a further question privately, at a time of your choosing." Millicent looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, with the expression she brought to difficult calculations, thorough, honest, without performance. "Stand up," she said. He stood. "Your cravat," she said, "has been crooked since you came through that door 40 minutes ago." She reached up, without ceremony, and straightened it with 2 precise adjustments. There. Something in the chamber moved. Not laughter, not applause, but the specific shift of a room in which something real has just happened, and the people present have recognized it. Lord Pembroke, who had been watching this entire proceeding with the expression of a man who has seen a great many formal inquiries, and never quite one like this, said, "I believe the business is concluded." She gave him his answer, in the garden of Cavendish Square, 4 days later. It was a Tuesday because she had decided she was not going to wait for Wednesday, which was itself an answer, though she did not say so. He came at 3 in the afternoon, and Charlotte Pearson let him in, with the expression of a woman who has been expecting this, and has several opinions about it, and is admirably refraining from sharing them. The garden was small and walled, and had a pear tree at the far end, that had clearly been there before the house, and the afternoon was cold enough to make breath visible, and Millicent was standing near the tree when he came out, with her coat on and her hands at her sides. He said, "I had several things prepared to say." "I know," she said. "You have been practicing them. How could you possibly know that? Because you arrived exactly at 3, which means you have been outside the gate for some time, and the things you say when you have been thinking carefully always have a particular quality." She looked at him steadily. "I would prefer you to say what is true rather than what is prepared." He looked at her for a moment in the cold garden, with the pear tree bare behind her, and the light falling flat and honest across the wall, and he said, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the most exact and genuine person I have ever known, and because I spent 6 years making the wrong choice, and because I do not want to spend another year without the specific quality that you bring to every room you enter and every problem you decide to solve. That is what is true." She was quiet. It was a real, considered quiet. The quiet of a woman who is thinking about it completely before answering. "You could not have said this 6 years ago," she said. "Not accusation, assessment. No. You are certain you can say it now?" "I am certain," he said. "I have been certain since the inquiry chamber, and before that, since the 3rd Wednesday in Cavendish Square, and before that, since the evening in the library at Harwick, when you showed me the quarterly accounts, and treated me as though I was capable of understanding them." She was quiet for a moment more. "Yes," she said. Then after a pause, "I will need the contract finalised before we discuss the Harwick arrangement." "Davies has already drafted the revision," he said. "Of course he has." There was something in her voice that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space. She held out her hand. He took it, and held it, and neither of them was wearing gloves because she had come out without thinking, and he had taken his off before coming through the gate, and it was very cold, and neither of them minded. They were married in April of 1851, in the church at the edge of the Harwick village, in the presence of the full household, and Mr. Davies, and Lord and Lady Fenwick, and Charlotte Pearson, who wore a hat that she had described to Millicent on 3 separate occasions in the preceding month, and which was, in the event, exactly as she had described it. Lord Ashworth attended. He sat in the front row. He did not speak to Millicent before the ceremony, and he did not speak to her after it. But when he passed her in the church doorway, he paused, and he said, "The South Farm accounts. I read your 1845 report." He did not say anything further. He did not need to. Mrs. Holt, who had been the Harwick housekeeper for 22 years, met them at the house door when they arrived and said to Millicent, "I have put your portfolio in the morning room. I thought you would want it near." Then she went back inside to direct the arrangements, which were considerable and entirely in order. 3 years into the marriage, Millicent formalised a set of estate management standards for the Harwick property that Mr. Davies, at her request, circulated to 12 neighbouring estates as a reference document. By the following year, 4 of those estates had adopted the tenancy review methodology in some form. The 5th sent an inquiry asking whether Miss Carr, they used the old name, which she returned corrected, whether the Duchess of Harwick might be available for a consultancy engagement of 3 months in the spring. She was, she wrote back, available for 6 weeks, at a rate she named precisely, and her terms were attached. In the spring of 1854 their son was born, and they named him James Clement Ashford, the Clement for Davies, which Davies had not been told in advance, and received when informed with the expression of a man who has been surprised into genuine feeling and is adjusting to it with the dignity of his profession. James was small and had William's dark colouring and Millicent's habit of watching things before responding to them, which his father observed within the first hour and found entirely unsurprising. On a morning in October of 1855, William came into the morning room and found Millicent at the writing table, with the estate accounts open in front of her and James on her hip, because he had learned to pull himself upright on the table leg, and she had preempted the falling by carrying him, and she was holding him against her side with her left arm, while making an annotation with her right hand, with the complete efficiency of a woman who had been managing 2 things at once for her entire adult life. James was examining the edge of the account book with the focused interest of someone who intends to eat it. William stood in the doorway and watched her, the way he had stood in the library doorway 12 years ago, and watched her by candlelight, except that now he had his coat on properly, and she was his wife, and the room was theirs. She looked up. She saw him watching. "He will not eat it," she said. "He is only considering it." "I know," William said. "He considers everything before he acts. He gets it from you." She looked at him with the specific warmth of a woman who knows she is seen completely and has decided, finally, and without reservation, that this is enough. "The East Farm figures are in the blue file," she said, "if you have a moment." He crossed the room, and she passed him the account book, and James transferred his attention to William's cravat, with the purposeful curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that things cannot simply be taken hold of. "It is crooked," Millicent said, not looking up from the accounts. William straightened it himself this time, because he had been paying attention, and because she had taught him exactly where the latch was, and because this was what love looked like when it was built by 2 people who knew how to build things to last.